Hi, this is Clay Boykin. I just completed a conversation with my producer, Dennis Tardan, and Terry Ayling from Australia. Here's that conversation.
Clay, your snipping, thing, it just reminded me of a funny film clip that somebody had sent to me. A guy went to the doctor. He lived in the country, and he said, "I'd like to be castrated, please." The doctor said, "Well, I am a country doctor and I have had to castrate some animals, but nobody's ever asked me before." He said, "Are you sure that's what you want?" And he said, "Yes." So anyway, a little later in the afternoon, he strolls into the pub and the guy says, "Mate, it looks like you've had a circumcision, your way you're walking." He said, "That's the word I was looking for."
That is, what a way to start off our In Search of the for the New Compassionate Male. I love the way that you started this conversation with the concept of castration. Because when in search of this new, because when I was growing up and when Clay was growing up, we were talking about how if a man was to be a man, he had to be walled off from emotions, and that if we were to do this, we would become like women. We would become castrated in that sense, and that's not what it's all about.
It's interesting, when you play with the word castrated. I mean, I think about, when we're talking about somebody for a role, we talk about casting them, and when we evaluate their effectiveness, we talk about their ratings. So rather than being castrated as men, we're being cast-rated. And often, we've lived with the deep wound, and we need to own that the masculine, energy and body has often been, a tool of violence and of abuse, not only to women and children, but also to ourselves. When men aren't aware and they're reacting rather than responding, they're unconscious. They abuse themselves as much as they abuse women. In Australia, we have 6 men a day kill themselves, and we're very, very saddened that statistically every 3 days a woman is killed by her intimate partner, and that's just unforgivable, really, and a really grave situation. But as you guys would understand, that because these conversations are so infused with energy, that the fact that 6 men a day kill themselves alongside that statistic, it just gets lost. And I think there's no greater need in our time than to help men with their own awareness, because it's profoundly impacting on our society and our future.
So Terry, let me just ask you now, these 6 men a day, my guess is that this is not necessarily military related or PTSD related.
No. We have very little of that, really. There's a high incidence of young men and older men. And I think the young men, it has to do with disillusionment, with relationship breakdown, confusion around their identity, and certainly disproportionate number of people in our rural areas, where there isn't work, or drought, or things are particularly tough. But also, I think the second highest category is men in their late 80s. And my sense is that, they have lived, probably their whole lives with the one woman, that relationship and family has so shaped their identity that if she dies before he does, then there's really nothing for him to live for. He's an empty shell.
Wow.
So might as well, exit stage right.
You know, Terry, I want to ask you something. For those of us in our audience in the United States, we have a caricature of the Australian, which comes from our movies and all, as being hyper masculine, very virile, good looking, strong. Does that translate into the archetype of the Australian men, or does that, or is that just like, you know, when people talk about us Texans, they say, well, everybody's got a cowboy hat and an oil well and rides a horse, and that's not true. So, could you talk about that for us?
Look, I think it probably is the caricature. You know, and I think, you know, for the second or third time in my life becoming single again, you know, at this time of my life, you know, I have a lot of opportunity to reflect on the relationship between men and women, and, you know, what that means in terms of my own sense of identity and what it means to be male. You know, one of the things my second wife said to me when she made the decision to leave, I talked about, you know, if she was to get into another relationship, what would she be looking for? And it really hurt me when she said, I'd be looking for someone more male. And, you know, it just kind of characterized, I guess, the profoundly different place that we're in. Mm-hmm. You know, because I do feel, and that, you know, that hurt, you know, as with each of the hurts in my life, has been a real catalyst for my own inner journey and my own work. And, you know, 3 or 4 years down the track from that statement, you know, my sense is, I reckon you'd be hard to find a more whole male, you know, than me. Mm-hmm. In a sense. Not that I'm looking to, you know, attract her back or anything like that, but, you know, I think still there is this sense of we want a buff, muscular, you know, guy who's good with his hands, you know, that can build things and, you know, earn a substantive income, you know, and, you know, and men's body image, like women's body image, you know, it's this, you know, we still create that kind of thing with our TV shows and things like that. Women still, you know, take a double take when they see a really good looking guy going past. But the reality is that, you know, while they want that, they also want something, my sense is they want something much deeper than that.
Yes.
And part of the confusion for men is that, you know, we're perhaps not so quick on the uptake as women. So we don't understand, we don't understand the confusing nature of women. You know, it makes it really, really hard to understand what women want. And my sense is that most women don't know what they want either. And because they're confused, they give mixed messages to men. And because they're even more confused, they just don't know what to be. So it leaves both men and women in a very confused and empty state.
It's interesting that you would say that, Terry, and that because right now in July of 2020, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and while there is a great deal of focus on the deaths, the number of deaths, because it makes that, the number of people who are ill or who have to go through this very difficult disease is so much bigger. And so when you look at the 6 men who kill themselves, what are the huge percentage of men that almost kill themselves, that are living a life of deep darkness and misery and depth, that just don't get to that point but are still living in the dankness?
You know, I think that statistically they talk about, you know, for every man that actually kills himself, 10 make an attempt on their life. So today, here in Australia, the 7th of July, 6 men will kill themselves and 60 will make a serious attempt on their lives.
And
But
then
and-
behind each one of those 60 is 100 more that are
that's
close.
right. Yeah.
That are,
So we had one of our social researchers who is actually an ambassador for the Australian Compassion Council, a guy called Hugh Mackay, wrote a book recently called Australia Reimagined, towards a less anxious and more compassionate Australia. And he talked about the two sides of the coin being that we have never been as socially disconnected and we have never been as anxious. So even before this pandemic, we had a pandemic of anxiety in Australia, and men, are disproportionately affected by that. They take less care of their physical health and their emotional health. And we need completely different strategies to reach men and to connect with them.
Hey, don't you see that mirrored here, especially now? And if I use the analogy or the of a lake, we in the United States had a full lake. Suddenly, the lake has gone down and has exposed what was there all along. All of the things that we were able to skip over because we had all of this abundance of water. And now that it's gone down, suddenly we're seeing that things are exposed that we hadn't, which puts us into a position, because everything that you just said, Terry, is what I have heard Clay and the circle of men that he has had. We've heard words that you would say, yes, those are exactly what is happening to us. This is bigger than just one country.
well, and what's happening in my awareness, I spent the past year and a half of this, since we started 8 years ago, really focusing on the gender aspect of it. And Terry, you and I've talked about this, the work that I'm doing with Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, seeking to find that common ground of deep healing between women and men, and recognize that that's a common start point. Not to compare who's is worse or anything, but we're both wounded, by whatever the patriarchal system. We're all victims in a sense, and then use that as a common point of departure to heal and to form a new relationship, allow an alchemy to happen when people connect like that. And so I've been full force into that as an extension of the contemplative approach that we're using in the men's circle. But then, boom, May 25th hits, George Floyd is killed, murdered. And all of a sudden, race is just right in the forefront. And so the race issue, the water levels come down enough that has surfaced, and it surfaced, I think, stronger than it ever has. The gender issues, and then a pandemic.
And the economic inequality of the people being so close to the surface that the minute it comes down, suddenly all of this is exposed.
Yeah.
And as I suggested, that the race issue is huge for us as well. We've had that same kind of lowering, exposure. In 1991, we had a royal commission, we call it, like a federal government inquiry around Aboriginal deaths in custody. But since that, in 1991, 454 Indigenous people have died in custody. So we have a huge issue as well. And I think that, the race issue and the gender issues, are different perspectives on the same wound. And I think one of the things that the coronavirus has done is it's broken us open to a sense of our common humanity. It's not as if we're in a male body that we only develop that male characteristic. We need to develop that, become whole in ourselves, and balance up. if you're in a woman's body, you need to develop, that
Mm-hmm.
dimension. And it's exactly the same in terms of the race issue, unless I understand that you are me and I am you, and, but for the grace of God, whatever it may be. And so that for me, there's something rich and dynamic about that dance and interplay. And in terms of the male gender issues, I mean, there's certainly a work that we can do together as men. I think,
Mm-hmm.
honor what you're doing, Clay, and that sort of stuff. But there is something unique about that dance. I think women still have a significant role to play in activating the male energy. Men have a responsibility in terms of, getting into that and understanding that and developing it. And I think men have a role of helping women to return to the feminine.
Mm.
And, what I find at the moment, the way I'm kind of describing my own relationship or lack of relationship journey is, for many years I felt it a genetic disposition because I was born in a male's body. I was very apologetic about that. I lived outside of my body. I venerated women. I admired them. I was intimidated by them. I wanted to develop that kind of feminine side. And then, coming back into my own male body and kind of balancing up a bit, I used to feel as though I couldn't meet a woman, in the deep sense of really meet her. Now I really find I'm having trouble finding a woman who can meet me, because most women, my sense at this point of their journey, have left unsatisfying relationships with men. They've developed their own masculine side to the sense that they don't really need a bloke anymore. What do we need you for? I could do it all myself. And so men are left on their own, often unconscious and unable to develop their feminine side because they don't have a woman to help them, teach them, nurture them into that space. Women are left on their own, with a highly developed masculine side, but not able to find a man who can meet them where they are so that they can then soften and open, and flourish, which is the feminine energy. So, I'm really concerned about what that means, not only for men. I think that's our focus in this conversation and a lot of our shared work, but beyond that, what it means in terms of the future of relationships and the future of society, because children are the victims of that, including the children that won't be born,
Right.
Not only those that will be born.
Mm.
Clay, there is the don't you see that healing and the importance of it, because we're all in relationship. I mean, this is not, anytime you turn one part of a gear, the rest of the machine has to turn, and it's none of it is done independently, as you're seeing. Don't you see that in all of our work?
Yeah, I do. And what felt right for me 8 years ago, because I didn't trust other men, and I had to get over that. I realized that there's some things in life that only I can learn from another man, but not trusting him, I've cut that off. And so I figured, if I feel that way, let me bring perhaps those other men that want to come together, and let's do it differently than the traditional men's group. Let's approach it more from a compassion standpoint, acceptance, non-judgment, nurturing, and see if we can learn together from one another how to go from head to heart, and then to be able to speak from the heart, and just focus on that part right there with men, with other men, in preparation, so they've kind of done part of their homework, so that they can then, now let's move and let's look at the relationship between men and women. I don't bring that into the circle, that aspect of it. It's got to be there, but this is more of a preparatory work. And the other men's group models that are there, that are more the traditional following the king, warrior, magician, lover, the mythopoetic with Robert Bly and so forth. Those all serve a purpose. But what I found was there was this one gap of the contemplative model that was not really being spoken to, and that's what I'm bringing up, to go in and be a hybrid with these others, because each men's group is going to be different, but really hone in on the contemplative model so that we can learn from one another, and then we can begin to show up to learn how to connect on a different basis with the women in our life.
Look, I think you're right, Clay. I mean, it's there's something about the other that is catalytic in this and dynamic. I feel as though my sadness about not being in an intimate relationship hasn't got to do with me being alone or bored or anything like that. I'm absolutely committed to doing my own work. I'm committed to my own evolutionary process, but I know that happens in a heightened way when you're up close and personal to another who lots of people see me. I have lots of deep encounters with lots of people, but nobody sees me in fullness, and
Right.
to have a person who can see you, 24/7 in that space, to challenge you and to heal you, whatever is really important. And Dennis, one of the, most significant things for me in terms of this coronavirus, because, you talked about the way that it's broken open our society and revealed stuff, brought stuff to the surface. Most of my work is with dying people and their families in the hospital and the hospice. And so when this coronavirus started, I'd done a lot of work on my own mortality, and, I'm very clear that, at the end of my life, the thing that I would want most is to experience the presence and touch of another. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't want to be alone. I would want to feel some sense of presence. But there are countless millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people that have died by this, horrific disease, who have died alone and without touch. And so I because I knew that was my greatest fear, the thing that I would want most, that was confronting to me, to think that, I could be one of those many people that died without that. But because of that, my life work has been shaped to be present with people in their dying, and to be able to touch, to actually be not only physically present, but emotionally and spiritually present, and be able to touch them in the deepest of ways. And so I had this kind of inner conflict between, my dying self and my compassionate, caring self. And it was a real kind of existential crisis. And it was very kind of, I went through a deep anguish with that. But I had this wonderful healing when I come to the realization that my dying self had, evolved to the sense where I could die alone and without touch if I needed to, like other people were. So the dying part of me gave permission to the caring part of me to say, it's okay, I know you want to be there, but you can't, and I'm okay, and it's okay. And there was this wonderful kind of sense of healing within me. And then some weeks later, this male humor, we talked about castration, but I was at the urologist after finding a lump, in my groin, expecting the worst.
Yes.
And I went into the urologist, and he said, well, I know this guy that's written a report. he's got a really poor choice of words. This is not a tumour. You're going to live to your 91, mate. You've got touchy testes. That's what he called it. You got touchy testes. So, you know, that immediately took the pressure off me. But what I realised about reflecting on that experience, Dennis, was that there was a part of me that was really frightened and powerless.
Yeah.
You know, I felt totally out of control. And I've done some work with Byron Katie and, you know, the work of Byron Katie. And I was in an online group actually during the same, you know, this COVID period. And one of the people that was sharing, the facilitator said, "How old are you?" to the person. And they said, "Oh, I'm 56. And she said, no. How old are you in this emotion?" And she said, "Oh, I'm 6. And what reminded me about is this part of me that was really frightened in the doctor's surgery and felt powerless was the child part of me.
Oh, Terry.
And when I could name that, I could then feel this wonderful maternal, feminine energy coming to wrap my arms around that kind of wounded child. But I also knew that there's a powerlessness in motherhood or a parenthood, that you do anything you could to take the pain away, but you can't. And so I could then feel that masculine part of me coming and wrapping my arms around the maternal part of me and the child part of me. And, you know, I could feel this appropriate male holding space, nurturing this family, you know, caring for this hurt child, supporting, you know, this powerless mother. And then I could feel this other dimension of me, which was this higher self, this spiritual self, just coming and embracing all of that. And I realized I was all of those parts of me all at once.
Wow.
So in those kind of both stories, I guess it's expanded me on the inside. This broken openness has caused a broken aliveness, and I can actually like bear witness to all of this happening within me as well as outside of me. And this beautiful dance that if I'm conscious to it and aware of it, you know, that it can be, you know, that I can become more whole and holy.
I love I love the concept of atonement and breaking it out to at 1 minute.
Yes.
There's that alignment. As you were talking, Terry, I had this picture of this huge soundboard. All of us have seen them inside the recording studios where you have the sliders that go up and down.
Yeah.
And I was looking at it as if it were an emotional board. And some of my emotions are very low. They're just barely and others and there's a harmony there. There's a balance there. And I saw you moving that slider up from your 6-year-old self and moving, and that's the kind of emotional growing. Because I ask, how do we as men, how do we grow? How would we go to the emotional gym and pick up that 2-kilogram weight and work with just the not the big 100-kilogram, but just to get something to be able to work on it. And that's the work that I see you doing, going through the process of feeling it and experiencing it and going through it.
Well, I think part of the strength of the male kind of psyche is that we are very much in our head, you know, in a sense, and we need to see things in very concrete ways. But, you know, I've always been fascinated by the notion of time, you know, and, you know, in the Christian tradition, which has been my background, there has been this sense of, you know, chronos time, you know, the clock time, and kairos time, the kind of ripe time. But what I'm learning from a lot of Indigenous spirituality, the Australian Compassion Council are working very closely with our Indigenous people about dreaming this continent for compassion and what would that be like, is that time actually isn't linear, it's vertical. So, you know, Dennis, I guess what I would see is that, well, my 6-year-old self, or, you know, whatever age that child was, can perhaps only pick up a small weight. But the 61-year-old self can pick up a bigger weight. They both exist within me. You know, there's not a time at which that 6-year-old isn't present. It's still present with me. But the gift is, you know, that our evolution and our awareness is, I now have the capacity within me, you know, as a 61-year-old that can carry, you know, perhaps less weight than I might have been able to carry as a 45-year-old, but more weight than a 6-year-old. Together we can carry this. You know, we've got, you know, everything we need, you know, and it exists within us.
Yes.
So there's this incredible expansiveness and capacity to self-heal, and, you know, because of the reconciling work, you know, that Clay and others are doing, you know, it starts first in us, and once we catch a glimpse of how we can do it, then, you know, it inspires us that it can happen with others, and it gives us a grace and a capacity to do that.
Yeah. You're working with the Charter for Compassion, as I am. Can you share some about what you're doing there in Australia?
Yeah, so back in 2017, Clay, did we meet at the Festival of Faiths? Is that where we met?
No, we met at the Parliament of the World Religions
Right,
in November of 2018.
Yeah, so the previous year, Dr. Lynn Reeder, my colleague, and I travelled for 4 weeks to throughout the United States and to Louisville, Kentucky for the Festival of Faiths. And it was during that time that we met Marilyn Turkovich and John Raymer and, you know, a lot of the kind of elder statesmen and women of the Charter work. And we quite audaciously caught this dream of Australia as a continent for compassion. You know, we're an island continent. It's a big country with a relatively small number of people in it, 26 million or something. And we thought, look, wouldn't it be terrific on the 21st of September 2021 if we could celebrate Australia as the first continent for compassion?
Right.
And so we started speaking that up. We kind of developed the idea a little bit, and we presented that at the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto, and have been, you know, talking about that since. We have an Australian Compassion Council, and one of the core, you know, the key strategies of that is the compassionate cities. The Australian National Parliament was the first national parliament to sign the Charter for Compassion. Not a lot happened since that time. That was some years ago. But we've since had the city that I live in, the city of Gold Coast, which is Australia's 6th largest city, and the city where Lynn lives in Ballarat in regional Victoria, that have signed the Charter and are working intentionally to becoming compassionate cities. And we have a kind of a strategy in place so that on the 21st of September 2021, we certainly won't have arrived. You know, there are some really deep issues, our race issue, our treatment of refugees and our, you know, last residents. But, you know, the bushfires and COVID-19 have shown just an enormous array of compassionate actions by all sorts of people that we want to highlight and celebrate and partner with. And my role on that, Clay, is as the lead for the Compassionate Cities part of that. Got it. And I'm also on the global Charter, Religion, Spirituality and Interfaith sector. And we've invited Clay and Sandy Hart and some others to have a conversation like this on a webinar a little later in the year.
Yeah.
What would be some of the indicators that would let you know that a city is becoming more compassionate?
Yeah, look, it's different. I mean, the 2 cities that we're working with at the moment, Ballarat has 100,000 people. It's in regional Victoria, and it has a very deep wound because a little bit like Boston, in the United States, it was a center of the Catholic Church, which was very deeply implicated with child sexual abuse. So they have a very deep communal wound around that. And I think, it would be interesting to reflect on how that has been catalytic for their response in terms of becoming a compassionate city. But because of the size of the city and that sort of thing, they're able to integrate, the charter and its work much more into city government and things like that. We haven't had the same experience on the Gold Coast. But I think part of the dilemma, Dennis, is that, it's difficult, in a way to find cities and organisations and institutions that are compassionate. Like you could say, we aspire to this value of compassion, but people that are in it don't always experience it, and they don't often act in those ways. So I guess what we're trying to do is to say, okay, I see compassion in what Clay's doing. I see compassion in what Dennis is doing. I see compassion in these people that are on the streets every Saturday feeding homeless people or something like that. And just to give voice to that kind of stuff.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because we have a media model, and we do in our society, certainly in the United States, that is built upon the more salacious and that it can be, the more it will keep our eyes glued for milliseconds longer onto the web page or onto the screen before it gets us. So therefore, if the model is built that way, and these compassionate activities and the work that we're doing is a harder story to tell. It requires more energy. It requires more nuance. It requires, but my goodness, the value, if we can continue to work on it, the value of these conversations. I know my conversations with Clay, with you, Clay, have absolutely transformed me. But it has transformed me. It's an inside-out game. It has to. It's one of those things that really, truly has to start with me, and it has to start with me being willing to look at myself and my side of the street. That's one of the things that in Clay that you've been doing with the work with In Search of the New Compassionate Male and the race consciousness, that we've been looking at ourselves and what was our part in this process. What do we have to own, whether we like it or not? What do we need to own as our part?
Yeah. I tell you, it's a big deal. This, I get overwhelmed. I said it the other day, and I think about, well, what's my role in this, and what do I do? How do I show up? And I want to just pull back and say, who the hell am I to even think that I can move the needle? And push out podcasts and have these conversations. Is it going to make a difference? That's the doubt that comes up in me. And because I don't know what the new compassionate male is. It's not one person, and it varies from culture to culture as I'm beginning to learn. And it's a fascinating search. It's the more searching outside I do of myself, the deeper I'm searching within myself. And it's certainly a growing edge.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I've got another choice. This is, if I'm going to show up for life, this is where it is.
We have a friend of ours, Christopher Howell, who has been part of Clay's life for much longer than he has mine, but he is part of mine now. But he talks about that this is the time, that if you ever wanted to live in a time when there was an opportunity to be there, when it happened, now is that time. It is not ever going to happen more than what is happening now.
Yeah, well, look, my spiritual journey, has come from the Christian tradition, but I now kind of describe myself as interspiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways I would describe the divine and our relationship with that is the happening. And in a sense, there isn't a time this hasn't been happening. We are caught up in the happening. Clay is a part of the happening. Dennis is a part of the happening. Terry's a part of the happening. And it's good to be reminded that, as I heard that podcast that you did, last week, and, Clay referred to, the story of the starfish, and we talk about, a drop in the ocean and, the ocean's in us and all that kind of thing. I just think that over time, I'm kind of letting go of the ego that, I'm not the Messiah,
Right.
but I am, I am. So my own, I've been playing with this notion of we describe ourselves as I am, I am Terry Ayling, or, I am the spiritual care coordinator, or whatever it may be. And, that's how God announced God's self, in the burning bush. That's how, Jesus described himself, I am, so there is this a convergence between, who I am and the I am. And, I just need to, at one level, get myself out of the way. At another level, honor my bit, your bit, Clay, in the happening. And so, as we hear each other talk, I wonder, Clay, why we're so apologetic, for our inability to do this stuff. Mate, you're doing it. We just need to remind each other, that this is exactly the way it is. And, the other thing I like about the, John, from John's gospel, and, he's very poetic in terms of how he describes, Jesus as the Word of God, and the whole, dilemma with the media, and trying to break into that, is trying to play that game. And I think it's important to do that. But this is the Word of God. Like, this is it. It's not this. And, one of the things I've learned, most powerfully in my spiritual practice, and the reason that after 25 years of being an ordained minister of the Christian church, without any scandal or anything like that, I decided to resign, is because I didn't want people making an assessment about what presence, looked like. My sense is that if I am fully present to another person, irrespective of whether anything comes out of my mouth, if there's a genuine commitment to be there for them and to be open to them, if I'm open and humbled to the magic that can happen, and that's the greatest, from a Christian point of view, the greatest Christian witness about, the Trinitarian nature of God. But often that happens without any words or anything at all. And I just didn't want to be in the situation where either I felt I had to say something to validate that presence, or to be open to the critique of my colleagues because I didn't do that. Because, I know plenty of them that they're saying, it sounds good, but it doesn't look good. Yeah. And there needs to be a congruence in that. And when there is, when what comes out of our mouth is what comes out of our lives, then that has power, And, I see that power in you, Clay.
I do too. I see it so much in you, Clay.
Thank you. That's hard to say.
You used the
And
word
I see it
twice, both times we've talked.
Yeah.
This sense of being overwhelmed. It's okay, mate. It's not about you.
Yeah.
There's no pressure on you. But hang on, mate, because it's
Yeah.
happening through you. It's surging through you. Just relax. Just enjoy. Just
These conversations, and especially Terry, our conversations that you and I've had, are so powerful, and it's so grounding to me. I know I get caught up in my head, and fix it and get it organized and blah blah blah.
yeah. And this is why the nuances are so important, Clay, because you
Yes.
know what? Like I've been in my head, and the transition to the heart and into the body we talked about is really important for blokes. But actually, one of the gifts that we offer to the planet is our head.
Yeah.
And what women need still of men, it's a different kind of thinking, but they need
Yes.
the mindful wisdom of men's thinking.
Yeah.
Like they're, we know they're crazy at times, and that's part of the beauty, and we need to be crazy too. But
Yeah.
actually, part of the male energy is, sweetheart, I'm just holding you. I know
That's
you don't
right.
want me to fix you. Let's do this. That rationality is part of the gift of the mass. So, what I'm conscious of in myself as I notice these things is just, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, not throwing the bloke
it's
out.
I hear people say, well, teach them how to move from their head to their heart. No, it's connect head and heart.
Yeah.
It's a different concept.
Yeah. So I think
And
it's
it
fair to
supports
like
what you're
that
saying.
notion of time, and it's like
Yes.
that notice of, it's not head or heart or body. It's all at the same time.
Yeah.
They all have to be in alignment, and what you said before, Dennis, about at one-ment, that's a beautiful thing. It's a inner journey of finding at one-ment. It's an intimate journey with another at finding at one-ment. It's our common humanity at finding at one-ment. It's our relationship with the divine. It's all about at one-ment.
Barry, can you talk a little bit about the role of elders in the tribe? Because you at 61 and Clay in your mid-60s and me at 72, we're the elders. We're in the elders of the tribe, whatever that would mean in the new, not just the new compassionate male, but in compassionate cities and in a compassionate world, and how we can play our part and be part of this. Can you talk a little about that?
Well, firstly, I just want to say something more about compassion, because one of the things we learn, through the research and the neuroscience is that compassion isn't something we have to learn. It's innate in us.
Yes.
Built
when
in.
you see another person suffering, it's the human gift to want to respond to that suffering. So there may be reasons, abuse or, a whole lot of things that might get in the way. We don't have to teach people how to be compassionate. We need to help them to be mindful of the things that might be obstacles to their compassion and try and kind of remove some of those things. So that's the compassion thing. But the other thing that I'm growing, in a way, without using that word for a long time, I guess I've operated in the compassion space for a long time. And whether it's part of our shared aging or just a new realization for me, but wisdom is the other wing to this bird. So not very often now will I talk about compassion without also talking about wisdom, because compassion without wisdom can be foolhardy. It's the difference between giving somebody a fish and teaching somebody how to fish, that kind of thing. We thought it was compassionate in the 50s and 60s, including in Christian missions, to take black children away from their parents and bring them up in white homes. Now, we might have thought it was compassionate, but in the fullness of time, it hasn't proved to be wise. So we need compassion and wisdom. And, so I'm spending a lot of time working in the wisdom space. So I'm glad for the question, Dennis, because, one of the things I'm really concerned about is that we have such wisdom in our elders and our mentors. They might not be particularly smart. We may not have any claim on kind of, real intellect or, wisdom, except that, we've been doing this for 60 years or so. And we made a shitload of mistakes along the way, and there are people that hate us, and wives that have left us, and kids that, aren't happy with us or whatever it may be. But, we've been around the block a few times, and that's worth something,
Yeah.
And so I'm concerned that if we don't harness the wisdom, of those members of our society, men and women who are older, if we don't listen to their stories, if we don't glean, the wisdom that they've got from, their longevity and their vast experience, we're impoverished. And so, I guess, I'm really applying myself to how do we hear those stories? How do we catch that wisdom? How do we connect that wisdom to young, energetic people? If I'm thinking about kind of transformation, I think it's almost generational. So we need the wisdom of people in the last third of their life to share that with people in the second third of their life, perhaps, who have, been broken open by life's experience, have some awareness and some openness to change, but they've still got energy and strength. They can pick bigger weights than we can, Dennis, at the moment.
Yes.
But they know how to lift wisely, if you know what I mean. Then they can then impart that wisdom, on the people in the first third of their life. I don't think it's necessarily about people in the third third of their life trying to connect that with people in the first third, because there just seems to be this kind of evolutionary process that we go through this stuff, and it's not until we're broken open, late 30s or 40s or something like that we really get a sense of identity and which way's up. And then if we have the right support and the right mentoring, men and women, we can save guys from killing themselves. We can enrich their mental health. We can save their relationships or help them not make a second bad choice, whatever it may be. Help them to work through their addictive behaviors, and they will have the energy and the wisdom.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
I'm stunned to feel the spectrum of feelings that I'm feeling talking with you, Terry and Clay. I find that conversation can be that I enter a conversation and I set an intention when I come in, that I will exit the conversation at a higher degree of consciousness than I enter it. Now, I don't know how that will be or where that will be or how, but if I set that intention, and oh my goodness, I feel so much lighter in my entire essence, just having had the depth of this conversation. I love how much work that I see you both doing on yourselves. I have this thought experiment that I do, that the distance from the tip of my nose to the center of my soul is exactly in parsecs and light years from the tip of my nose to the end of the light cone of the universe. And that with those two balances, now I have my internal universe, and this is the one that I have been given, and I get a chance to have it be as loving and kind and joyous and compassionate in all the ways of you were talking about, Terry, about how we needed to have treated ourselves or been treated that we did not have, that we can now go back and redo.
And as Clay obviously experiences in his groups, that this conversation, particularly amongst men who are unfamiliar with this stuff, it breaks through our aloneness and reminds us of our all oneness.
Right. Dennis, that's what we touched on with Christopher.
Yes.
And his work in times past to take men out on an adventure to break open, to have a cathartic experience, to open them up, and the impact. But then often it's like, okay, well, now what now? And sitting in our circle, maybe somebody comes out changed one night, but the changes are very small and over time. And I know that I'm not the man I was 8 years ago when we started this.
Not the man I was merely since November.
Yeah.
One of the things, Terry, that we're talking about as we're closing out on our hour here is the despair that people feel. And that's where I want to, I believe that we can connect. There is a hopefulness in our ability to connect with one another, that when we do, it gives me some place to go. It gives me some place to grow. And I need that connection. And I'm not sure that the way that we've arranged how we live in these internal nuclear family dwellings is the healthiest for the way we are wired as human beings. It feels like that we're more tribal, and that we need that tribal connection in order to thrive.
I think you're right. I think that's particularly true of men. Here in Australia, men tend to connect, on the sporting field or in the pub, but it's a very superficial kind of connection. If you ask many blokes, do they have any friends, like real friends that they could reach out to, most of them don't. And, in a way, if they're in a relationship, they lean sometimes unhealthily on the women that they're partnered with. And when invariably those relationships end, despite the rhetoric of the court and the system to say, well, we want both parents to be involved, there's tragic stories of men that are separated from their children for all sorts of reasons.
Sure. There
is this incredible despair and loneliness amongst many men. I mean, that's the reason, my sense, is why so many men kill themselves or get into addictive behaviour or escapist behaviour, through pornography or drinking or whatever it may be. And so I still think there's something needs to happen in terms of this interplay between men and women. I get the reason it's not working, but I think that women are still part of the solution to the male problem, and men are still part of the solution to the women's problem. And, so I guess when we have the interview with Clay, I mean, one of the things I want to talk about is that reconciliation between the gender, because although our work with men is important, and men need to know that they're not alone, they need support in that unless that's actually fleshed out in relationships with women, I think it's going to be satisfying, but not deeply satisfying.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for this wonderful hour, the beginning of which is, and I will warn you right away, I'm going to be reaching out to you and following you and asking to be part of another graceful conversation with you. Clay, we must do this again.
Absolutely.
We must spend time with you again, please.
Thank you. It's been a great fun. Yeah, and a great blessing. So.